a member of the Russian armed forces made a significant error in judgment. Because of this error, the entire order of the Russian army has been thrown off the people of Russia for making such a mistake. There are a lot of different hypotheses floating around about why the Russian soldiers got it wrong. Let's have a conversation about this remarkable occurrence, shall we? To begin, let's go back in time a little bit and review what happened. Gordon Russia Maggot has had a very successful academic career throughout his entire. He was eligible for financial aid at some of the most prestigious educational institutions in Russia. Something happened to him just as he was about to finish his education at the university, and it altered the course of his life. After making the decision to invade Ukraine, Putin completely upended the lives of everyone currently residing in Russia. As soon as Meek received his diploma, he was conscripted into the. He was only 22 years old at the time, and he had no intention of giving his life for Putin. He aspired to have a successful career in academia and to major in science. He had a lot of hopes and dreams, but Putin ruined the shopping center when neither of them expected to be drafted into the army. He experienced a great deal of fear because he was unprepared to fight. In addition to this, the education that he obtained during this time was very. Magma had no prior experience with military strategy, but despite this, he was quickly thrust into combat after receiving only a cursory amount of training. Because the Russian army was suffering from a chronic lack of soldiers, the Russian military's entire organization was thrown into disarray. As a result of the successful operations of the Ukrainian army, a significant number of Russian soldiers were either killed or. It is also well known that thousands of soldiers deserted their posts or participated in a rebellion against their superiors. As a result of these crises within the Russian army, a large number of soldiers were deployed to the conflict zone without having received the appropriate level of training. Mohammed was a member of that group. While in the conflict zone, Mohammed had a great deal of fear. He frequently awoke in the middle of the night screaming from his nightmares. He witnessed the passing of many of his friends. He was terrified that he too would be killed in this conflict. This thought caused his psychological state to deteriorate even further. Mohammed served in the 37th Separate Guard Motorized Rifle Brigade during his time in the military in Russia's Krysko-Alost region. He served as a sentry at a military installation. On the Russian side of the border with Ukraine, you'll find Krysko Glass. Mohammed lived in constant dread of an operation being carried out by the Ukrainian army. That was the reason he had such a hard time sleeping. He never left the lookout tower where he was stationed. He was trying to keep an eye on everything in the area using the camera that was attached to his sniper rifle while Mohammed was stationed at the watch. Two other soldiers began making their way toward the Russian base through his binoculars. He observed more than the soldiers in question. Mohammed was still terrified despite the fact that the soldiers were dressed in Russian army uniforms. He was completely unaware that these soldiers were going to show up. We are going to return believe that these individuals were members of the Ukrainian armed forces. He was under the impression that in order to carry out a covert operation, they had disguised themselves as members of the Russian army because he had such a poor opinion of the soldiers. He was filled with dread. Mohammed made the decision to stop the two soldiers as they approached the Russian base because they were heading in that direction. He yelled for them to stop and asked who was there following Mohammed. The Russian soldiers had the impression that they had been taken prisoner and consequently laid down on the ground. They were going through such intense fear that they were completely unable to respond to Moga's questions. Although the soldiers had made the decision to move forward by crawling, Mogus looked through his binoculars and saw that the soldiers were actually moving forward. Loved was now absolutely certain that those men were members of the opposing force. He made the decision to begin fur. To begin, he fired a shot into the back of the head of the soldier after he had finished off one of the soldiers. He then turned his attention to the other one. He fired his weapon once more, and this time the Russian soldier was severely hurt. When the other sentries saw this, they immediately began firing on Mohammed. The exchange of gunfire between the soldiers was quickly brought to end. Mohammed was taken into custody almost immediately by Russian commanders. Sadly, during the exchange of gunfire, one of the Russian soldiers was killed. Tamir Gah, a 19-year-old Tartus Stone resident and soldier, has been identified as the fallen service member. Velas, K, 22 years old, and originally from Nob, was the soldier who suffered a serious. On the other hand, this soldier passed away while being treated in the hospital. The occurrence is being looked into as thoroughly as possible. At this time, the preparation of reports on this subject has been started by every commander in the Kherson region. The Russian press is devoting a significant amount of attention to these reports right now. Two of the problems highlighted in the reports are particularly: the first issue is that the Russian soldiers are always living in a state of panic and fear. According to the statements of all of the Russian commanders, the soldiers are experiencing a great deal of fear. This fear causes Russian soldiers to make mistakes on a regular basis, and as a result of this fear, Russian soldiers frequently make mistakes while fighting. During the course of the battle, a great number of Russian soldiers never emerged from the trench. This widespread dread of Russian military personnel is harmful to the image of the Russian armed forces. Overall, the world is filled with stories about how cowardly Russian soldiers were during the conflict. Putin boasted that Russia possessed the most formidable military in the world, but the Russian army is widely regarded as the most fearful military in the world. The additional information provided by the Russian commanders is much more interesting, and it can be found in their reports. It has been reported by Russian commanders that their troops are experiencing psychological issues as a direct result of the fear they are living with. The question that remains is why the Russian commanders are paying attention to these issues. In what ways can this problem affect the overall direction that the war? On the battlefield, Russian soldiers are seen to be behaving in a manner consistent with a state of constant panic every day. These soldiers spend a significant amount of time in the conflict zone. The conflict has been going on for nearly a year, and the soldiers are physically worn out as a result of the fact that soldiers in the Russian army do not receive sufficient food and are unable to find a suitable place to. It is common knowledge throughout the Russian military that its service members suffer from a problem known as sleep apnea. The nightmares that keep Russian soldiers awake at night are becoming increasingly frequent. As a consequence of the fact that this circumstance persisted for an extended period of time, Russian soldiers started to experience a great deal of psychological. According to the data presented in the report, a significant number of Russian soldiers frequently experience hallucinations. The Russian military personnel have trouble differentiating between reality and fantasy. The soldiers who are hallucinating begin shooting in a variety of locations. According to reports, a significant number of Russian soldiers have been killed as a direct consequence of these incidents. The Russian commanders have the soldier who is having psychological issues treated in a medical facility. However, as of right now, there are not any more spots available in Russian hospitals. The Russian military personnel are having a hard time overcoming this obstacle. The consistent hallucinations experienced by the soldiers have been a contributing factor in the occurrence of a number of accidents. In order to solve this issue as quickly as possible, the Russian commanders want their troops to be provided with antidepressants on a continuous basis. On the other hand, this might bring about a decline in the performance of the soldiers serving the Kremlin administration in the conflict zone, a solution to the psychological issues that have arisen among the Russian soldiers as a result of their excessive fear. But the severity of these issues is only growing over because of the difficulties that the Russian armed forces are facing. Hundreds of service members are deserting their units, which has an effect on the overall trajectory of the conflict. The situation for the Russian army is not looking good at all. What are your thoughts on the widespread dread of Russian military personnel? What do you think the impact of this fear of Russian soldiers will be on the overall direction of the? What are your thoughts on the fact that Russian soldiers make mistakes on a regular basis? What are your thoughts on the reports that were put together by the Russian commanders? Please share your thoughts with us. Keep up with us here for further updates. You can help us out by becoming a subscriber. During the course of 1 year, Russia's invasion of Ukraine sparked a major revolt that brought Russian commanders and Russian soldiers into the Kremlin. It has become just as unbearable for Russians to remain on the front lines or to refuse to fight in this tragic war as it has become for Ukrainians. In fact, when we examined this procedure, we discovered there was a strong sense of community and a constant fight for survival among the Ukrainians, while the Russian commanders and soldiers were encouraged to wonder what they were fighting for in a conflict that was ultimately pointless within the span of one. Russia, in the context of Putin's imperialist policies, is attempting to advance on the territory of Ukraine, while Ukraine is defending its country against the occupying forces. As a result of Russia's occupation of Ukraine, the country has now entered a phase in which its decline is irreversible. Russia, which suffered a deep economic wound as a result of decisions to impose economic sanctions against Russia in conjunction with the beginning of the, continues to see the effects of these decisions, the visible aftermath of that wound on the front for a significant amount of time. The Russian army had largely lost its capability for combat, and the chain of command within the army had become so disorganized that it was impossible to unify. So the question is, how did the Russian army get to this point? In point of fact, the most significant factor is the lack of discipline and ineptitude that exists within the qualifications of the soldiers that Putin appointed to high-ranking positions in the military were not investigated, but those positions went to people who were personally close to Putin. During the conflict, Putin dismissed a significant number of individuals whose performance was not deemed adequate. However, the commanders who were appointed to fill those positions were unable to perform up to the standards that had been set. In addition, throughout the duration of the soldiers were denied the ability to meet even their most fundamental requirements. Even some soldiers were deployed to the front lines with rusted AK-47 seconds from 1945. Of course, Russia's struggles to recover from the Great Depression are also a contributing factor in the Army's careless treatment of its soldiers because of the severe impact that Western sanctions had on the Russian economy, domestic production, and Russia came to aid. This is assuming that approximately 80% of the fundamental needs of the Army were not met. The inability to supply the domestic markets led to the cessation of production, which was one of the contributing factors in the dissolution of the Army. The war effort that Putin's troops are putting forth in Ukraine is not negatively impacted in any way by his consideration of this matter or his search for potential exit strategies from the current economic coag. The majority of the Russian troops that are currently stationed in Ukraine are soldiers who were mobilized in the fall. These soldiers are frustrated with their superiors because they were forced into battle without proper equipment on the battlefield. This rage is reflected in the abandonment of trenches and the decision to surrender by Russian soldiers who in recent months had deserted their post or been captured by Ukrainian forces. 80% of them were mobilized and almost all of them complained that they were sent to Ukraine by Russia unarmed and lacking in the most fundamental of necessities. This topic has been the subject of a number of videos that have been circulated on social media, the most recent of which has caused a significant amount of fallout. A request for additional equipment and medical supplies has been made by a Russian regiment in recent. The commander of the group of mobilized soldiers from Russia's Kava Oblast addressed the call to the regional governor, Sergei Tai, saying that soldiers came almost naked in a desperation video call for its war in Ukraine. The call was addressed to the regional governor. Soldiers that have been assigned Topol are seen crying almost entirely naked. They're lacking in medical equipment, and the only piece of medical equipment that they possess is a tourniquet. The soldiers who have been mobilized have only 2 pieces of body armor between them and almost no bodyguards. Everything else, including the sides, is totally open to view. They have almost nothing else, and the soldiers don't even have thermal underwear, so they are on the verge of freezing. At the end of the video, people are seen pleading with the authorities to pay attention to what is going on and take the appropriate actions. Because it was shared on various social media platforms, the video has received more than 400,000 views to date. Russia was the first country to admit that there were issues with the military supply of. We have already informed you in our previous statement dated October 26 that Russia does not have sufficient equipment for the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were conscripted in accordance with the mobilization decree issued by Russian President Vladimir Putin on September 21st. According to reports from Russia, Putin has recently established a council that is working to resolve issues related to equipment, and regional officials are working to provide the equipment that is lack. It is clear to us at this point that Russia has not made any headway in resolving this issue on the Russian side. Issues with the equipment have put the Ukrainian side in a position of great advantage with the majority of the mobilized forces, or they are simply sent to the front lines with inadequate equipment and without even the most fundamental necessities, such as food during the winter. They require more clothing and equip. They require clothing appropriate for the cold weather. They require the ability to maintain their body temperature. A video that was recently uploaded to social media shows soldiers who have been mobilized receiving New Year's gifts in boxes that bear the emblem of the ruling party in the country, which is called United Russia. In one of the gift boxes, there were items such as underwear, cigarettes, razors, tourniquets, bandages, oatmeal, pasta, and Russia treats its soldiers with such indifference and expects the same level of performance from them. We'll make advancements on the front lines no matter how you look at it. This is a contradictory situation, and it is the most glaring example of the incompetence that exists within the Russian army. The question is, as a result of the Russian army's lack of discipline and inability to do their jobs, where will the war? Recent commentary on the conflict in Ukraine has been seen by specialists. The scale of the war also has its own unique characteristics. In the event that this conflict is reduced to a simple endurance contest, the Ukrainian people and their international backers are concerned that there will be more people on the side of Russia, and Russian President Vladimir Putin is open to the idea of any number of Russian citizens serving in his administration. Perhaps there will be casualties in order to accomplish his goals. There is no point in the West sending any of its most advanced weapon systems because they won't be effective. The losses that Russia has already sustained are absolutely staggering. It has been reported that between 140,000 and 150,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, making this the largest number of Russian casualties suffered since World War I. However, the commander of the Ukrainian forces recently expressed his concern that Russia's armed forces contain an infinite number of men who can be mobilized. Also, Putin can continue to throw dead bodies into the conflict until such time as the Ukrainians have been worn down. Of course, it is not enough to have a larger population to win a war, nor is it enough for leaders to be willing to put their young men in. If it were South, Vietnam might be a sovereign nation that supports the United States today. Even though they have a numerical advantage, that does not necessarily mean that Russia will win. This appears to be the calculus that Putin used and the advantage that he relied on, which is unfortunate for those who want the bloodshed to stop as soon as possible. At the beginning of the conflict, it was actually the Ukraine that held the advantage in terms of men. A year ago, Russia began the invasion with an initial force of approximately 150,000, which faced off against an army of approximately the same size that was spread across the second largest country in Europe. Invaders typically require a 3-to-1 advantage over the territory's defenders in order to successfully capture and occupy a territory. This is the general, and the Russians did not make things any simpler for themselves by frequently operating in small formations that were only lightly defended without any logistical support or air cover, and by inflicting heavy losses on the Ukrainians. In the early stages of the conflict, according to estimates provided by the United States, Russia had lost approximately half of its initial occupation force by the end of the special military operation that Putin was running was becoming unsustainable, and he was forced to resort to temporary measures like raising the age limit. Even though military service was mandatory and lucrative, signature bonuses were offered to service members. This was not enough to stop the bleeding combatants belonging to the mercenary group known as the Afghani Precautions, a growing number of members of the Wagner, most of whom were convicted criminals recruited directly from Russian prisons, participated in the conflict as well. Since then, Wagner has ceased the practice of conscripting prisoners. It appears that a good number of inmates have come to the conclusion that life in a Russian prison is preferable to life in a Ukrainian prison. When Putin issued the order to partially mobilize 300,000 soldiers in September, everything underwent yet another sea. After this, an astonishing victory was achieved against the poorly defended Russian positions surrounding Kiev, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. The vast majority of the newly recruited soldiers were plunged into combat almost immediately, despite having received little to no training, and in some cases being provided with only partial equipment to contribute to the strengthening of the front lines. The completion of the mobilization was announced by the Russian Minister of Sergei Su in the month of October. Officials from the Ukrainian intelligence service estimated at the beginning of February that there were more than 300,000 Russian soldiers stationed in Ukraine, with hundreds of thousands more standing by in reserve. You have, without a doubt, aimed to raise the total number of soldiers serving in the Russian armed forces to 1.5 million from the current total of 1.1. We are able to say that despite all of the other challenges faced by the Russian military, it does not currently suffer from a lack of manpower. On the other hand, by finding a solution to one issue, he might have created new ones. There is no question that the addition of new manpower has made a difference since the Russians withdrew from the city of Khan in November in order to move to more defensive. The Ukrainians were unable to make any significant further advances in their position. However, these victories came at an unexpectedly high cost to the Russians. In order to push backward, the Russians relied on so-called man-wave attacks that were carried out by unsupported infantry. These attacks were frequently met with heavy casualties at the hands of Ukrainian machine guns and grenade launch. At the beginning of February, NATO estimated that the Russians had lost up to 2,000 men for every 100 yards of territory that they had gained. The fact that Russia has a larger military contingent is without a doubt an asset on the battlefield. On the other hand, when these soldiers go into battle unarmed and without any ammunition, they are the same as live targets naturally. The armed forces of Ukraine is comprised of a smaller number of people than the Russian army, but the arsenal of weapons and ammunition that the Ukrainian army possesses now gives it a distinct advantage over the Russian army, both on paper and in the field. In fact, we see glaring illustrations of this in badminton, Valor, which is the location of Russia's most recent defeats in international competition. Even if Russia were to send all of its people to Ukraine, it would not be able to accomplish much there due to the technological disadvantage. Over the course of the past year, we have witnessed and will continue to witness how effective technology can be when pitted against human power. So what are your thoughts, guys, regarding this matter? I would appreciate it if you would share your thoughts in the comments. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and that you have notifications turned on so that you are notified when we upload new videos. We appreciate you keeping an eye on us. The statements made by Putin came as a surprise. With the assistance of NATO, Ukraine is making preparations to expel Russia from its territory in opposition to Russia. The peace forces have assumed their position. Putin was unable to find a way out of this particular situation. The revelation of the information that infuriated Russia has taken place since the conflict first broke out. It is a well-established fact that Russia has been making headway in the conflict on its own. On the other hand, Ukraine benefits from the backing of every country in the world. In fact, this support keeps growing stronger on a daily, as evidenced by official statements as well as ammunition aid. While Russia went into the war with confidence due to the fact that it is a powerful country, Ukraine continues to get one step ahead of Russia day by day, despite the fact that the entire world has turned against us, a cruel form of occupation. The Ukraine began to shift from a defensive to an offensive. Russia, which has sent occupation forces into territory belonging to Ukraine, runs the risk of suffering a crushing loss in this conflict. Since the beginning, Ukraine has been getting support from other countries, but the support it has received has never been this significant before. On the other hand, Russia's inexperienced army is having trouble holding its. The presence of a large number of mercenaries and unwilling soldiers is a contributing factor in this, along with the conscripted Russian army and a Ukrainian army that is valiantly fighting for independence. In addition, many nations from all over the world are sending battalions of their armed forces to Ukraine, which is not making things any simpler for Russia in this predicament. Eliminating that would result in a different situ. Everything originated in the country that is now known as the United States of America. The undertaking that has the potential to bring an end to the occupation in its entirety has been reinstated. This project, which has seen a significant amount of interest, will be initiated in the coming days. The international community's press is of the opinion that it is high time for Russia to face consequences for breaking international law by conducting numerous heavy weapon tests on the Ukrainian army. The potential for Ukraine to reclaim its previous territory is currently regarded as one of the most pressing concerns facing the nation at this juncture. The reason for this is that Russia illegally and without any justification occupied these territories, which led to this situ. Russia has gone completely insane as a result of the fact that other nations place such high importance on the recovery of these territories. As a form of retaliation, Russia maintains its policy of issuing nuclear threats whenever it perceives itself to be in danger. It is common knowledge that in the event that these dangers actually materialize, they will have repercussions not only for Ukraine but for the entire. The state of global peace is teetering on the brink of disintegration as a direct result of Russia's actions. The unease that other countries experience as a result of being threatened is causing them to turn against Russia, while the number of countries that support Ukraine is growing. Over the course of the past few months, the United States has consistently maintained that it will not provide Ukraine with long-range Patriots. If they were handed over to the Ukraine, it would set off the Third World War, but then it made the decision to fire these missiles, which resulted in a major uproar because the United States had been contemplating doing this for a long time, but had chosen not to. This move by Russia came as something of a surprise. This infuriated Putin, and he did not hold back when it came to reiterating his threats to use nuclear weapons since a long time. The United Nations has been monitoring Russia because it does not follow its rules. It was prepared to offer assistance to Ukraine and was waiting for it. Russia has been completely cut off from the rest of the world as a direct result of the rash actions and decisions taken by Vladimir Putin and his government. Instead of being seen as support, the assistance provided to Ukraine is now seen as a direct intervention in the vote. As a result of this Putin's anger toward other countries has increased. Things have reached a whole new level as a direct result of Russia's recent escalation of threats and pressure, not only against Ukraine, but also against other countries. Russia's actions have been observed by NATO before this, and throughout its history, many different policies have been pursued to alter the course. This is demonstrated by the consistent assistance they provide to. In order to generate a reaction against Russia, a coalition known as the Peace Forces was formed, the majority of the members of which are members of NATO. The primary goal of the Peace Forces, as the name suggests, is to ensure peace by supporting the righteous. They want to stop Russia, which has unjustly started moving towards organized invasions, so their goal is to push them back. It has been speculated that this group will endow Ukraine with a significant amount of. It is known that it will be able to take a much more prominent position against Russia if it has such power, and this power will allow it to do so. These predictions have caused panic on Putin's part because NATO has made it clear that they are prepared for a hot war, even though they are not currently in favor of one. They will be on Ukraine's side if and when it becomes necessary in the future, knowing that if Ukraine has the firepower of NATO, they will be severely set back in the. Putin was forced into a corner as a result of this situation. Putin, who had never been willing to make a deal before this, demanded that a resolution to what had occurred be reached as quickly as possible. Crimea, which was located on Ukrainian territory, was conquered by the Russians. However, since there was no comprehensive explanation from the Ukrainian government at the time Russia appeared to own Crimea in official document, Zelensky is working toward regaining ownership of these lands. His efforts in this regard demonstrate how much further Ukraine is getting from day to day. The fact that Ukraine, which at first was only trying to defend its country, was eventually able to protect its own interests by asserting its rights revealed a shift in the direction that the conflict was taking. It has come to light that Iran has been supporting. It was discovered that Iran had given Russia assistance in the form of ammunition, despite the fact that many countries expressed their support for Ukraine's war of independence. There is no longer any doubt regarding the fact that Iran has supplied Russia with 1,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, in spite of the fact that the Iranian government claims that the equipment in question was delivered a significant amount of time before that. It is now common knowledge that the assistance was provided throughout the conflict. The actions taken by Iran have stoked fears of a third global conflict and contributed to their spread, continue to cause tension on top of everything else. The global agenda and the media have created an environment that is very fraught with tension. But Putin has not changed his mind and has no plans to withdraw from the conflict. War analysts believe that Russia's stance could eventually result in the outbreak of a full-scale global conflict. Russia is aware that Ukraine is supported by a coalition of many powerful states, despite the fact that it has a strong alliance with Iran. It is also common knowledge that with the assistance of these nations, it will only be a matter of time before Russia is expelled from the territory of. Russia's ability to endure continues to decrease on a day-to-day basis, even though there are a lot of things that are contributing to this. The two things that are most important are Putin's prophetic policies and a stubborn desire to drag out the war for as long as possible. But while Putin's own army is reluctant and worn out from the war, it is facing off against a powerful Ukrainian army that has the support of almost the entire. The fact that the Russian army has been fighting independently ever since the conflict broke out has repercussions not only for the military conflict, but also for the political conflict. While ammunition aid is being delivered to Ukraine, Putin is fuming about the fact that Russia can't even find supporters for itself in the international community. Putin, who has garnered a lot of attention in the politics of the world, is still being put under a lot of pressure thanks to the many discourses. That includes his decision to resign. In addition, it is common knowledge that he has begun to lose support, not only in the press of the rest of the world, but also in the press of his own country. The more they try to exert more control over the people who take to the streets and demonstrations, the more people take to the streets and demonstrations as a. The fact that these demonstrations are also taking place in other nations demonstrates that support for Ukraine has been accepted not only by governments, but also by the people of the world. Despite the enormous amount of pressure that is being exerted internationally, Putin, it is abundantly clear that he has absolutely no plans to pull back his army under any circumstances.